Hi everybody, welcome back. We're now moving into the final section of this course, which is the conclusion. And in the conclusion, we're just going to wrap up everything that we've learned and also provide a few more tips and techniques and bits of advice which will hopefully help you to feel a little bit more confident when you head into your exam. In this first lecture of this section, it's going to be a long video. The reason for this is that we're going to be answering a task 2 question from start to finish, and because you have a 40-minute time limit in the exam and you have to write at least 250 words, naturally that's going to force me into a longer video. But feel free to pause this at sections and come back later, maybe even split it into days. Maybe listen to the first couple of paragraphs, come back for the second 2 paragraphs later. Take it at your own pace as per usual. So let's focus on the question which we're going to answer now. So here's the question we're going to answer. Let's read it out together. Some people view teenage conflict with their parents as a necessary part of growing up, whilst others see it as something negative which should be avoided. Discuss both views and give your own opinion. So, first thing we need to do is to identify the question type. That's the first step of planning. And the question type, hopefully you realise, is a discussion opinion question. So we'll write that down under our plan. Discussion opinion question. The second step is to highlight the keywords. The second step of planning. So let's find out the keywords here. In my opinion, the keywords are teenage conflict, necessary, and negative. So it could be rephrased really easily as, is teenage conflict necessary or negative? You do have secondary keywords as well, and it's important to at least refer to them. Part of growing up should be avoided with parents, of course. But the really key words are the ones that I've highlighted here. You've got the topic and you've got the 2 opinions in the form of adjectives, necessary and negative. So once we have that, we can think about writing a plan. So the plan is the third and final step of planning. And remember, we don't want to plan the introduction and we don't want to plan the conclusion. We have formulas for those. We can save time by not planning them. We've got to think about the themes of each paragraph though. And in order to know what we're going to talk about in each paragraph, we have to have an opinion. It's a key part of the requirements. So my opinion is that I think it is a necessary part of growing up. Now, if you remember from my lecture on the different question types, I suggest that we put the side that we agree with in the second paragraph. So I'm just going to title this one necessary. And I'm going to title the first body paragraph negative, so we know the theme of each of our paragraphs. And then we're going to go through, and this will look quite familiar if you remember the building body paragraphs lecture on how we create nice and cohesive and well-developed body paragraphs. Each of these letters corresponds to a different sentence type. The first one is T, which stands for topic sentence. This should contain the main argument for the opinion presented. The opinion is that teenage conflict is negative. Why is it negative? Well, I would say that it can be harmful to relationships. I don't have to be very specific, it's just a plan. So just a couple of key words here. Try not to overdo the plan. Why is it harmful to relationships? Well, certainly conflict can cause tension in the family. And we can go into a bit more detail when we reach that sentence, but for now, just keeping it quite simple. Now, example of tension and how, example of conflict and how it can cause tension, something that parents and teenagers often disagree on, something like smoking, particularly as it's quite a negative paragraph. We want to look at quite a negative example to support the point. Now, again, just the one word because we'll develop it later. The alternative, if you remember from the conditional sentences lecture, the alternative is where if we want to emphasize how conflict is negative, we can look at how not having conflict is positive. It's that if-then sort of structure. So I'm going to title this no conflict, and the result is happy families. Nice and simple, nothing dramatic with the language, just coming through the plan nice and quick with some ideas there. We may even join those two sentences together to create the conditional. 4 sentences in a paragraph is absolutely fine, as long as it's all well developed. Let's look at the necessary paragraph then. So, what's my main argument for why it's necessary? Well, I'm going to look at the task language here to help me. I can see they've written part of growing up. Another way of saying this, it's important for development. This is a nice open-ended idea. It almost wants me to develop the idea because it's not clear enough yet. And so I'll do that in my supporting sentence. So, important for development. Why? I think it helps teenagers, I'll just write teens here because it's the plan, to form opinions. And they're kind of forming their sense of self, I would say. For an example, maybe it's different eating habits. So we could look at vegetarians in a family of meat eaters, for example. This could cause conflict, but it's important for that teenager to engage with that conflict so that they can form these opinions. What happens if that teenager does not confront his parents, if they're not willing to engage in conflict? So the alternative is actually the exact same as above. It's no conflict. But the result is opposite. The result is now a negative result. Now, I think it would lead to unassertive, lacking in confidence adults. So I'm just going to write unassertive adults here, and again I'll develop the language later. So there's our plan. Let's leave that on the screen. And as we mentioned, we don't want to plan the introduction or conclusion because we have formulas. Now the formula for the introduction was general statement, paraphrase, and possibly, if you want to, a plan sentence. I'm just going to look at the general statement and paraphrase to save a bit of time. So my general statement, remember the different introductions, nowadays, these days, in recent years, there is no doubt that, it is important to consider. I'm going to choose there is no doubt that because I can easily think of something which both sides would agree with. Okay, so thanks to the modal verb can, I've included a sentence which pretty much nobody could disagree with because it stops me from generalizing and it's now just a generally true statement. There's no doubt that adolescence it's not always, but it can be a difficult period for both youngsters and their parents. It doesn't say whether it is good or bad, that's for later, but it just introduces the idea and helps us to smooth our way into the opening of the essay. Now we got to think about the paraphrase sentence. And the first thing that I think we should do is introduce a complex sentence. If you remember from the lecture on complex sentences, to do that, we need to use a subordinating conjunction like although or while or despite. I'm going to use the word although here to create a sense of contrast between somebody else's view and my own view. So although some people believe that, now I could write teenage conflict. Wouldn't be a terrible thing. It would be okay. But I think if we can immediately demonstrate our intent to paraphrase and to show our range of vocabulary, that's even better. So what we're going to use is referencing. Referencing by way of demonstrative pronouns like this and these and such. So I believe that conflict at this time, adolescence, we know it's about teenagers and parents because we've written it there, so we don't really have to say teenage conflict with their parents. So although some people believe that conflict at this time, what's a way of paraphrasing negative, maybe don't just look for synonyms, try to think of different ways to say the same thing. So we might say here, does more harm than good. Sort of idiomatic language. It's not overly idiomatic. That would be maybe inappropriate, but it's it shows natural understanding of collocation. So conflict at this time does more harm than good. I would argue, so we're showing our separation from that view and we're using a comma at the appropriate time for the complex sentence, I would argue that it is, now what's a word for necessary? What's a word for necessary? You know, we could use the word important if I want to borrow it from here. If we sit with it a bit longer, we can find another synonym. Let's go for the word essential. So an essential part of growing up. How can we paraphrase that? It is an essential. I might borrow now my topic sentence language from down there. That's okay. I might change it later. I might not even need to. But don't worry too much about paraphrasing everything. You've got to finish the essay. Don't worry about perfection. You can always underline words and come back to them later if you want to. So I'm just going to write, it is an essential stage of teenagers' development. Notice the apostrophe after the S to make it possessive. Now, I don't need to write a plan. I don't need to say this essay will, because it's very clear from my introduction what this essay is going to discuss. I don't have to be so blunt about it. When your writing is of a high quality, it should be clear to the reader what he is going to be reading about in this essay. However, it is important that in an essay like this, a discussion opinion essay, that you present an opinion. We've presented an opinion very clearly with I would argue. So there's our introduction. I have a word count of 43 words. It's a nice number. It's not too long, it's not too short. So into the body now, into the body. And because we are looking at a discussion opinion question, it's a discussion. There's an opinion involved, but it's a discussion. And like with any discussion, you're looking at one side, you're looking at another side. So what am I going for here? Maybe you can get it before I finish. On the one hand. And you might be able to guess what I will be introducing my next paragraph with, but we'll come to that later. On the one hand. Okay. Now, a good topic sentence should consist of both the view and the argument. And here I'm going to introduce a nice template that you can use for many different topic sentences. Those who believe argue that. If you want to avoid the generalization, you might add a might argue that. But I'll give you a template here, an example. On the one hand, those who believe education should be free might argue that it leads to a stronger economy. So you can see what we might use here. Those who believe, what's the view? Teenage conflict is negative. Yeah, we could say negative. What's the adjective of this word here? The adjective is harmful. So those who believe teenage conflict is harmful might argue that now I've got a bit of a problem because I've used the word harmful in my plan, and you certainly don't want to repeat that quickly. So it's okay, we just got to think on our feet, try to find something else. Maybe instead of an adjective, we can use a verb instead. You can see the noun here, harm, that also works as a verb. We've got the verb harm that we could use. Be a bit repetitive. What's a synonym of harm? Why don't we go for the word damage? So might argue that it can damage relationships. Maybe a bit more specific. Between parents and their children. We know we're talking about teenagers. Teenagers are still technically children to an extent, so it's okay to write this with paraphrasing the word teenager. So there's our topic sentence. On the one hand, those who believe teenage conflict is harmful might argue that it can damage relationships between parents and their children. Then we say why. Notice the question, why? Well, if I was asking you the question why, you might say, well, it's because, but we don't want to start a sentence like that, but very, very close. You say it is because, but when we start a new sentence, we often change the it for the this. And then you've got the opening. This is a very good way to start the vast majority of support sentences. This is because, we're just explaining why. So this is because such What's another word for conflict? Lots to choose from here. Arguments, confrontations, disagreements, disputes. So I'm going to use that word that I just chose at the end there, disputes. This is because such disputes can, let's use the verb create. And then don't be afraid to just copy from your plan. The whole idea of a plan is to speed up your writing. So don't worry about that at all. Don't be too dependent on it. And do be careful to make sure you're not missing out any important grammar that you might have missed in the plan. But certainly don't be too hesitant to just copy from the plan. This is because such disputes can create tension in the family. We have an example. Instantly, you should be writing, for example, without even thinking too much about it. You've got the E there, that translates straight to example, for instance, to illustrate. You can score a band 9 with cohesive devices like this. They may be very regular, but you can still do so. So, for example, this is going to be a bit tricky. We're going to speed through this example a little bit, but hopefully it will get the point across about how to use an example. It is quite common for young people, so a paraphrase of teenagers, quite common for young people to begin smoking at their age. Why do they do it? To impress their peers. But the resulting, again, we've got to find another word for conflict. So the resulting confrontations with parents can lead to difficulties with communication afterward. So that's a long example. Examples can be a bit tricky to write, particularly when you're giving real life, kind of tangible, physical examples, but those are the best ones to write. Being a bit more abstract with your examples isn't quite as effective, so it's harder, but it is better. So for example, it is quite common for young people to begin smoking at their age to impress their peers, but the resulting confrontations with parents can lead to difficulties with communication afterwards. If you wanted to, you could just remove the reason. It's not really essential to the task at all. It might just give a little bit more justification to the example that you're using, because it's about teenagers. So you could remove that as well. I'll leave it in for now. So I'm going to join the last two sentences together, as I suggested that I might do earlier. It's an alternative sentence, and in any alternative sentence, it can be good to begin in contrast. If. It's immediately into the conditional. Force yourself into that complex grammar. In contrast, if there is no conflict between parents and teenagers, what comes now? Comma. End the clause. Just like a regular complex sentence, you need that comma before you move on to the independent clause. So if there is no conflict between parents and teenagers, there will be, so notice I'm using the first conditional here, there will be, because I think people who are arguing for this side think that it is possible that there can be no conflict. They do think it's possible, and when something is possible, we use the first conditional. If it's unlikely, we'll use the second conditional. So there will be a much greater sense of, now notice that I force myself into using a noun here. What's the noun of happy? Nice and simple, happiness in the family. Done. Okay. Yes. You might notice that there's an in the family here twice, so let's maybe change that. There'll be a much greater sense of happiness among family members. Let's look at the word count. 132. That's very, very close to being half. It's just a bit over. So 125, bang on halfway. 132 suggests that we are right on cue for just creeping over the 250 mark by the time we get to the end. And that's where we want to be, because that gives us a lot more time to check our work at the end of the response.